You smell like war, sir. People come here to eat, not to remember things they'd rather forget. The words sliced cleanly through the soft clatter of silverware and quiet conversations, hanging in the warm afternoon air of Miller's diner like an accusation no one wanted to challenge. Every fork seemed to pause halfway to a plate. Every pair of eyes drifted toward the old man standing just inside the entrance. Thomas Callahan didn't answer. At 84 years old, silence had become a language he spoke better than anyone around him ever could. He remained where he was, one weathered hand resting lightly on the brass handle of the glass door as it slowly swung shut behind him with a gentle click. He wore faded blue jeans, sturdy brown work boots polished more by time than by wax, and an old olive field jacket whose fabric had softened after decades of faithful use. The jacket carried the unmistakable scent of old canvas, cedar from a closet long undisturbed, machine oil that no detergent could ever erase, and something older still, something impossible to describe but easy for strangers to judge. Emily Carter wrinkled her nose before taking another deliberate step backward, the white apron tied neatly around her waist contrasting sharply against the irritation spreading across her face. At 24, she had learned how to smile at generous customers and ignore difficult ones, but this old man unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't simply the smell. It was the stillness. Most embarrassed people apologized. Most angry people argued. Thomas did neither. He simply looked around the restaurant with pale blue eyes that carried no resentment, only quiet observation. Sunlight spilled through the front windows, stretching across polished checkerboard tiles and empty booths waiting for the dinner rush. Families laughed over burgers. A retired couple shared pie near the window. A truck driver stirred cream into his coffee while pretending not to watch. The entire diner seemed to lean toward the stranger without realizing it. Emily folded her arms. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Thomas finally moved. Slowly. Deliberately. He took 3 measured steps toward an empty booth near the back corner, the one facing the front entrance. It was a booth with a clear view of every customer who walked inside. Before sitting, he gently removed his weathered cap and placed it beside the napkin dispenser with the kind of care usually reserved for something far more valuable than faded cloth. "Sir," Emily said more firmly, following him, "I don't think you've heard me." Thomas looked up at her with an expression so calm it almost felt out of place. "I heard you." His voice was low, rough around the edges, yet remarkably steady. "I'd just like a cup of black coffee. We're not serving you." A nervous laugh escaped from somewhere near the counter. Another customer whispered something under his breath. Someone lifted a phone, pretending to check messages while quietly recording the scene. Thomas glanced toward the front windows instead of the faces watching him. Beyond the parking lot, the July sun shimmered against rows of pickup trucks and family sedans. His eyes settled on the entrance for only a second before drifting toward the old clock hanging above the pie display. 2:57. He checked the worn wristwatch beneath the sleeve of his jacket. The hands matched perfectly. Then he folded his hands together on the tabletop as though he had all the time in the world. Emily's patience disappeared. "Sir, you're making everyone uncomfortable." Thomas offered the faintest nod. "I won't be here long." "Then why are you here?" she demanded. His eyes returned to the door. A quiet smile touched one corner of his face, so subtle that only someone watching closely could have noticed it. "Because someone made a promise," he said softly. "And Rangers keep their promises." Thomas did not shift in his seat after speaking. His hands remained folded on the worn laminate table, while the afternoon sunlight traced the deep lines across his weathered face. The old clock above the pie display continued its steady rhythm, each second sounding louder than it should have inside the growing silence. Emily Carter searched his expression for irritation, embarrassment, or defiance, but found none of them. It unsettled her more than an argument ever could. Most customers protested when asked to leave. Some apologized. Others demanded to speak with the manager. This man simply waited as though the entire room no longer mattered. The quiet confidence irritated her. She crossed her arms more tightly. Sir, I am asking one last time. You need to leave. Thomas lifted his eyes from the tabletop and met hers with the same calm that had never changed since he walked through the door. I understand what you are asking. Then why are you still sitting here? She asked. He glanced once more toward the entrance before answering. Because I said I would be. Emily let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. To who? Thomas smiled so faintly that it almost disappeared before anyone noticed it. Some old friends. A young couple sitting 2 booths away exchanged amused looks. One of them whispered quietly. Sounds like he got stood up. Another customer chuckled into his coffee. The truck driver near the window shook his head without saying anything, choosing instead to watch through the reflection in the glass. Near the cash register, Brian Foster finally looked up from the afternoon receipts. The restaurant manager had spent nearly 15 years solving problems before they reached the dining room, but the unusual silence caught his attention faster than raised voices ever could. He adjusted his tie and walked toward the back booth with practiced confidence. Afternoon, sir, Brian said politely. My waitress tells me there has been a misunderstanding. Thomas nodded once. No misunderstanding. Then perhaps you understand that this is private property. I do. Brian waited for the old man to stand. He did not. We try very hard to make every guest comfortable. Brian continued. Today several people have expressed concerns. Thomas slowly looked around the diner. Families continued eating, although far more quietly than before. A little boy colored on the paper placemat without paying attention to the adults. An elderly woman watched him with sympathetic eyes before returning to her tea. The room looked perfectly ordinary. Has anyone told you they are afraid of me? Thomas asked. Gently. Brian hesitated. Not exactly. Then they are uncomfortable because someone suggested they should be. Brian opened his mouth but found no immediate response. Emily stepped beside him before the silence could linger. It is the smell, she insisted. People should not have to deal with that while they are eating. Thomas lowered his eyes to his old jacket and gently brushed an invisible speck of dust from one sleeve. Some smells stay with a man, he said quietly. Whether he wants them or not. The words carried no bitterness. Only acceptance. Brian cleared his throat. Sir, if you leave peacefully, there will not be any problem. Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, causing several nearby customers to look up at once. Instead of anything dramatic, he carefully removed a folded piece of white paper that had yellowed with age. He unfolded it with slow, deliberate movements and looked at a handwritten date before placing it back into his pocket. Then he checked his watch again. 2:59. His smile returned, slightly warmer this time. I appreciate your patience, he said. I believe I only have one more minute to wait. Brian Foster looked at the old man for another long moment before exhaling slowly. He had managed difficult customers before, but Thomas Callahan did not fit into any category he understood. There was no anger in his eyes, no confusion in his words, and no trace of fear despite every eye in the restaurant following him. It was as though the pressure filling the room belonged to everyone else except him. Brian rested one hand against the edge of the booth. Sir, I am trying to handle this respectfully. Thomas nodded. And I appreciate that. Then help me understand why you cannot simply come back another day. Thomas looked toward the front door again. Because another day would break a promise. Emily let out a frustrated sigh. You keep talking about promises like somebody is actually coming. Thomas answered without taking his eyes off the entrance. They always did. Several customers exchanged amused smiles. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap quietly muttered. Sounds like he has been watching too many old war movies. His wife lightly nudged his arm, but she smiled as well. The atmosphere had shifted from discomfort to quiet entertainment. People were no longer eating. They were waiting to see what the old stranger would do next. Emily reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a printed guest receipt. She laid it flat on the table in front of Thomas, even though he had never ordered anything. This conversation is over, she said firmly. You need to leave now. Thomas glanced at the blank receipt without touching it. I have not had my coffee yet. You are not getting one. That is your decision. And leaving is yours. Thomas smiled politely. Not quite yet. Brian rubbed his forehead, already imagining the complaints that would appear online before sunset if someone posted the recording that several customers were obviously making. He lowered his voice. Please do not make this harder than it has to be. Thomas looked up with genuine kindness. I am not the one making it difficult. Before Brian could answer, a soft voice spoke from behind the counter. Emily. Assistant manager Olivia Brooks had been quietly organizing invoices near the office doorway ever since the exchange began. Unlike the others, she had watched Thomas instead of judging him. There was something familiar about the careful way he folded his hands, the straight posture that remained despite his age, and the habit of checking both the wall clock and his wristwatch with almost perfect precision. Emily turned toward her. What? Olivia walked a few steps closer. Did he actually do anything wrong? Emily frowned. He is refusing to leave. Before that. Emily hesitated. No. Olivia looked toward Thomas for a brief second. Did he raise his voice? No. Did he threaten anyone? No. Brian folded his arms. Olivia, that is not the point. She nodded respectfully. I know. I just think something feels different. Thomas overheard the exchange but remained silent. His attention returned to the old wristwatch beneath his jacket sleeve. The second hand swept forward with quiet certainty. 3 o'clock. At that exact moment, somewhere beyond the diner windows, the distant rumble of several engines drifted through the warm summer air. It was faint enough that only Thomas reacted. His eyes softened, and the smallest smile appeared again, carrying neither triumph nor relief, only recognition. He slowly rose from the booth, straightened the front of his faded olive jacket with careful hands, picked up his weathered cap, and faced the entrance, as though welcoming guests he had expected all along. The low rumble outside grew stronger until every conversation inside the diner faded beneath it. It was not loud enough to shake the windows, yet it carried a steady rhythm that drew curious eyes toward the parking lot. Emily instinctively glanced through the front glass before folding her arms again. Probably a motorcycle club, she muttered. They can wait outside. Thomas remained standing beside the booth, his weathered cap resting against his chest. He did not move toward the door. He simply watched with quiet patience, as though each passing second confirmed something he had known all along. Brian stepped closer, determined to finish the situation before new customers walked inside. Sir, whatever you are expecting, you still cannot remain here if my staff has asked you to leave. Thomas looked at him with the same calm expression. I understand. Then please. Thomas slowly shook his head. Not until they arrive. Emily gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You really think somebody planned a reunion in the middle of a diner? Thomas answered without hesitation. Not somebody. Brothers. The word settled into the room with unexpected weight. Olivia noticed the way he said it. There was no attempt to impress anyone. No performance. Only certainty. She looked more carefully at the old olive jacket draped across his shoulders. Years of fading had softened the fabric until it almost blended into the afternoon light, but one corner near the inside pocket had pulled slightly open when he stood. Just beneath the fold she caught a glimpse of carefully stitched black and gold thread before the jacket settled back into place. It lasted less than a second. Still, something about the embroidery felt strangely familiar. While Brian continued, trying to persuade Thomas to leave, Olivia quietly stepped behind the counter and opened the restaurant computer. She told herself she was only trying to understand why this elderly stranger seemed so certain that people were coming for him. Across the room, Thomas once again checked both the wall clock and the old watch on his wrist. 3 minutes had passed exactly as he expected. Outside, several vehicles rolled slowly into the parking lot, not with screeching tires or unnecessary noise, but with deliberate order. A dark pickup truck stopped first. Behind it came 2 sport utility vehicles, then another pickup. Customers nearest the windows leaned sideways for a better look. "That is more people than I expected," someone whispered. Emily shrugged, refusing to admit even the slightest curiosity. "Coincidence." Thomas said nothing. His eyes never left the entrance. Olivia typed a few simple words into the search bar before stopping halfway through. Instead of searching his name, she entered a phrase she had noticed in her memory from the stitching she thought she had seen. Ranger Unit Reunion. Hundreds of results appeared. Most meant nothing. Then one article caught her attention. It mentioned a tradition among former Rangers who gathered every July to honor promises made decades earlier. Olivia felt an unexpected chill despite the warm afternoon. She looked back toward Thomas, then toward the parking lot where doors quietly opened one after another. Men stepped out slowly, some wearing pressed collared shirts, others in simple denim jackets. Their ages varied, but every one of them carried himself with the same composed confidence. None hurried. None spoke loudly. They simply looked toward the entrance of the diner with expressions that suggested they had finally reached the place they had promised never to forget. The first man through the diner door did not look like the hero from an old movie. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his blue button-down shirt was tucked into worn jeans, and a pair of reading glasses hung from the front of his collar. He paused only long enough to remove his baseball cap before scanning the room. His eyes settled on Thomas. Immediately, and the years seemed to disappear from his face. Behind him came another man walking with the help of a polished wooden cane. Then another. Some carried themselves with the effortless posture of lifelong soldiers. Others moved more slowly, their steps measured by age instead of urgency. Yet every face shared the same unmistakable expression. Recognition. Respect. Relief. The conversations inside the diner faded until only the quiet hum of the ceiling fans remained. Emily stared toward the entrance, confused by the growing line of older men entering one after another without speaking. Brian instinctively stepped aside to avoid blocking the doorway. Olivia watched from behind the register, unable to pull her eyes away from the visitors. None of them looked angry. None appeared interested in the uncomfortable scene that had unfolded minutes earlier. Their attention belonged entirely to one man standing beside a corner booth with a weathered cap resting against his chest. Thomas smiled gently, the kind of smile reserved for people who had shared decades instead of days. The first visitor approached until only a few feet separated them. For several seconds neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other with quiet understanding that no stranger could have translated into words. Finally the newcomer broke the silence. "You are right on time, Tom." Thomas chuckled softly. "You are 3 minutes late, Frank." A few of the men behind him laughed, their voices warm with familiarity rather than embarrassment. Frank Reynolds shook his head with a smile. "Traffic on the interstate. We are getting old." "That sounds like an excuse." "It probably is." Their easy conversation carried the rhythm of friends who had picked up exactly where they left off, even if months had passed between meetings. Emily looked toward Brian with uncertainty replacing confidence. "Do you know these people?" she whispered. Brian slowly shook his head. Olivia glanced back at the article still open on the computer screen. She noticed another sentence she had overlooked before. Every July, surviving members gathered to honor a promise made by their unit many decades earlier. They would always meet if they were still able, no matter how far life had taken them. Her eyes widened as she looked at the calendar beside the register. It was the exact date mentioned in the article. Thomas reached into the inside pocket of his faded jacket and carefully unfolded the yellowed sheet of paper he had shown no one. Frank recognized it instantly. "You still carry it?" "Every day," Thomas replied. One by one the others stepped closer, smiling as though they already knew what the paper contained. It was not a certificate or an award. It was a simple handwritten list of names with a single sentence written across the bottom in fading ink. "We meet every July as long as one of us can still answer roll call." Thomas gently folded the paper again before slipping it back into his pocket. "Looks like everyone answered today," he said quietly. Frank looked around at the familiar faces gathering inside the diner and nodded with deep gratitude. Not everyone, he answered softly. But everyone who could. No one inside the diner seemed willing to move. Even the young boy with the crayons had stopped coloring, watching the growing circle of older men with quiet curiosity. Frank Reynolds glanced around the room before looking back at Thomas. You found the same booth. Thomas smiled. I always do. 43 years, another ranger said softly. And you still pick the seat facing the door. Thomas rested one hand on the back of the chair. Old habits survive longer than we do. Gentle laughter spread through the group. It was not loud enough to disturb the silence that had settled over the restaurant. It sounded like the laughter of people who had carried the same memories for so many years that words were no longer necessary. Olivia quietly stepped away from the register with her phone still in her hand. She had found more than enough to understand who these men were. The article she had discovered mentioned annual reunions, decades of friendship, and a unit whose members had stayed connected long after leaving military service. Several photographs showed younger versions of the same faces now standing only a few feet away. One picture made her stop completely. A much younger Thomas stood in the center of the group, wearing the same calm expression he wore today. The years had changed his hair, his posture, and the lines on his face, but not his eyes. She looked from the photograph back to the man himself, realizing she had been looking at him as though he were simply another elderly customer. Emily noticed Olivia staring at the phone. What did you find? She whispered. Olivia hesitated before answering. I think we misunderstood him. Emily folded her arms. Because his friends showed up? Olivia slowly shook her head. Because he never lied. Emily looked toward Thomas again. He was introducing old friends to one another, as though no time had passed at all. They asked about grandchildren, health, long drives, and retirement projects. One man joked about forgetting names while another reminded him that he had never remembered names even when he was 25. The conversation was warm, ordinary, and completely free of bitterness. No one mentioned the awkward welcome they had received. No one complained. Frank finally looked around the diner and smiled. Tom, did you order already? Thomas answered with quiet amusement. I tried. Several rangers exchanged puzzled glances before Frank noticed the untouched booth, the blank receipt still lying on the table, and the uncertain expressions on Emily and Brian. His smile faded, not into anger but into understanding. You have not had your coffee? Thomas simply shook his head once. Frank nodded slowly before turning toward the counter. Then let us fix that. His voice remained calm and respectful. We have been keeping this man waiting long enough. Brian took an uneasy step forward. Sir, I do not think we realized. Frank gently raised one hand before Brian could finish. It happens. There was no accusation in his tone. People see age before they see character. Those words settled over the room more heavily than any raised voice could have. Emily lowered her eyes toward the floor. For the first time since Thomas had entered the diner, she noticed the careful way he stood, the patient expression that had never changed, and the complete absence of resentment in his face. She suddenly remembered every sharp word she had spoken and found herself wishing she could gather them back before they had ever reached him. Thomas looked at her with the same quiet kindness he had shown from the beginning. It is all right, he said gently. Everyone deserves the chance to know someone before deciding who they are. Emily reached for a fresh coffee mug with hands that no longer felt steady. The confidence she had carried only minutes earlier had quietly dissolved into something far less comfortable. She filled the cup with freshly brewed black coffee, placed it carefully on a small saucer, and walked toward Thomas without looking at anyone else in the room. Every step seemed louder than the last. When she reached the booth, she gently set the cup in front of him. Your coffee, sir, she said softly. Thomas looked at the rising steam before meeting her eyes. Thank you. He spoke with the same quiet warmth he had shown from the moment he entered the diner. There was no sarcasm. No victory. No reminder of the way she had treated him. Emily swallowed hard. I I should have listened before I judged. Thomas wrapped both hands around the warm mug, letting the heat settle into his weathered fingers. We all make quick decisions sometimes. Emily lowered her head. Mine was unfair. Thomas smiled gently. Recognizing that is what matters. Frank Reynolds watched the exchange with quiet approval before turning toward Brian. Do you mind if our group uses a few tables together? Brian immediately shook his head. Of course not. Please. Whatever you need. Within moments, several employees began sliding tables together while customers willingly shifted their seats to make room. No one complained. In fact, more than one guest quietly offered to help. The atmosphere inside the diner had changed completely. The awkward tension that had filled the room earlier had disappeared, replaced by something warmer and far more genuine. Conversations slowly returned, but they were softer now, almost respectful. Olivia carried a stack of clean menus toward the group before stopping beside Thomas. Sir? She asked carefully. May I ask you something? Thomas looked up. Certainly. How did you know they would come today? Thomas rested one hand on the folded paper inside his jacket pocket before answering. Because for more than 4 decades, no matter where life carried us, somebody always found a way. Frank nodded with a quiet smile. Snowstorms. Hurricanes. Flat tires. Hospital visits. We have seen all of it. Another ranger laughed softly. One year I drove almost 1,000 miles because my flight was cancelled. A second man smiled. I crossed 3 states after my truck broke down. Frank looked around the circle. We promised that if one brother was waiting at the table, nobody would let him wait alone. Several customers nearby fell completely silent after hearing those words. The young boy who had been coloring earlier tugged gently on his father's sleeve. Dad, he whispered, are they heroes? His father looked across the room at the older men laughing over ordinary conversations, and then answered quietly. I think they are friends who never forgot each other. Thomas heard the exchange and smiled into his coffee. Outside, the bright July sunlight reflected across the parked trucks while a gentle breeze stirred the American flag hanging near the entrance. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee slowly replaced every earlier complaint about the scent of an old jacket. Emily noticed it too. She realized that what she had called the smell of war had never really defined the man sitting before her. His patience had. His loyalty had. His quiet dignity had. Around the joined tables, the rangers began greeting one another by first names, asking about families, grandchildren, fishing trips, and old hometowns. Time seemed to fold gently around them, turning strangers into witnesses of something far more powerful than a reunion. They were watching a promise being kept, exactly as it had been made many years before, by men who believed that some commitments only grew stronger with age. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the diner floor as fresh cups of coffee appeared one after another along the joined tables. The rangers settled into their seats with the relaxed ease of men who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Their conversations drifted from grandchildren to fishing trips, from old hometown diners that had disappeared decades ago to roads they still enjoyed driving simply because they could. Laughter came easily, but it never became loud. It carried the quiet confidence of friendships that had survived entire lifetimes. Brian walked to Thomas with both hands clasped in front of him. Mr. Callahan, he said carefully, I owe you an apology. I judged the situation too quickly. Thomas looked up from his coffee and smiled. Managing people is not easy. That is not an excuse. Brian lowered his eyes for a moment. I should have spoken to you before assuming the worst. Thomas nodded gently. Then you learned something today. Brian gave a grateful smile. I believe I did. Emily returned carrying a fresh basket of warm biscuits. She placed them in the center of the tables without charging anyone. These are on the house, she said quietly. Frank Reynolds looked toward her with a kind smile. That is generous. Emily shook her head. It is the least I can do. She hesitated before looking back at Thomas. May I ask one more question? Thomas set his coffee cup down. Of course. When I said you smelled like war, why did you not get angry? The room grew still again, not from tension this time, but from curiosity. Thomas rested his hands together for a moment before answering. Because you were not really talking about me. Emily frowned slightly. I was not. Thomas slowly shook his head. You were speaking about something you did not understand. Anger would not have changed that. Emily stood quietly, absorbing every word. Thomas continued in the same calm voice. Life leaves marks on everyone. Some are easy to see. Others stay hidden. Mine happened to carry a scent that reminds me where I have been. Someone else carries grief. Someone else carries loneliness. Another person carries fear. We rarely know the weight another person brings through the front door. No one interrupted him. Even the gentle clink of silverware seemed to disappear. Olivia felt her eyes drift toward every customer in the restaurant. The young family by the window. The truck driver finishing his lunch. The elderly couple sharing pie. She suddenly realized that each of them had arrived carrying stories no stranger could recognize. Frank quietly reached into his wallet and removed an old photograph. It showed a much younger group of rangers standing shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright summer sky. Time had faded the colors, but not the smiles. He placed the photograph beside Thomas's coffee cup. Still missing a few faces, he said softly. Thomas looked at the picture for several seconds before gently touching one corner with a fingertip. They are still here, he replied. As long as someone remembers them. Around the table, every ranger fell respectfully silent. There was no formal ceremony and no dramatic speech. They simply bowed their heads for a brief moment of gratitude before lifting their coffee cups together. Customers throughout the diner watched without fully understanding every memory being honored, yet somehow they understood enough. One by one, several guests quietly lifted their own cups as well. No one had asked them to. It simply felt like the right thing to do. In that small roadside diner, respect spread through the room without commands, without uniforms, and without a single raised voice, carried only by the quiet example of one old man who had never stopped keeping his promises. As the afternoon slowly slipped toward evening, the last rays of sunlight stretched across the diner floor, turning the old checkerboard tiles into long bands of gold. Empty coffee cups and shared stories covered the joined tables where the rangers remained gathered, no longer counting the hours because time had never been the reason they came. Thomas Callahan leaned back comfortably in his chair, listening more than speaking, smiling whenever another memory found its way into the conversation. For the first time that day, the diner felt exactly as it had been meant to feel. Warm. Welcoming. Human. Emily quietly walked over carrying a small paper bag. She stopped beside Thomas and held it out with both hands. I packed you a slice of apple pie for the road, she said softly. You do not have to pay for it. Thomas accepted the bag with a grateful smile. Thank you. Emily hesitated before speaking again. I hope you will come back next year. Thomas looked around the room before answering. If I am fortunate enough to be here, I will. Frank Reynolds chuckled. And if he forgets, the rest of us will remind him. Gentle laughter circled the tables once more. Brian walked to the entrance and carefully turned the sign on the glass door from open to closed even though business hours had not quite ended. A puzzled customer reaching for the handle looked through the window, saw the gathering inside, and simply nodded before walking away with a smile. Brian returned to the group. Some moments are worth protecting, he said quietly. Olivia looked at Thomas one last time before asking the question that had remained in her heart all afternoon. After everything life has given you, what keeps you coming back to the same promise every year? Thomas rested his hand over the folded paper inside his jacket. Because memories fade if nobody carries them. He looked around at each familiar face seated near him. One day someone will attend this gathering for the last time. Another brother will keep coming. Then another. That is how people are remembered. Not because history books tell their stories, but because ordinary people choose not to forget them. Silence settled gently over the diner once again. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence of judgment. It had become the peaceful silence of understanding, The young boy who had asked his father about heroes earlier quietly walked over holding the paper placemat he had been coloring. On it was a simple drawing of several older men sitting around a table with steaming coffee cups. Across the top he had carefully written, "Friends Forever." He handed it to Thomas with a shy smile. Thomas accepted the drawing as though it were something priceless. "I will keep this," he said sincerely. "Thank you." The boy beamed before hurrying back to his family. One by one, the Rangers stood, gathered their jackets, and prepared to leave. There were handshakes, warm smiles, and quiet promises to meet again the following July. Outside, engines started one at a time, their steady sound fading into the peaceful summer evening. Thomas remained near the doorway for a final moment before putting on his weathered cap. Emily opened the door for him without being asked. As he stepped outside, she noticed that the scent she had judged so quickly no longer reminded her of war. It reminded her of loyalty, sacrifice, friendship, and promises that outlived the years. Thomas looked back with one final smile before walking toward the waiting trucks where old friends greeted him like family. The diner slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, but nobody inside would ever see an elderly stranger in quite the same way again, because respect is never earned by the clothes a person wears or the first impression they leave behind. It is earned by the life they quietly choose to live, and some promises become so powerful that they continue teaching strangers long after the words themselves have faded.